Welcome. We've got a recording in progress. For those who can't join us live, my name is Chris Bentliff. I'm here to introduce you to a couple powerful people in the space of ERPs. We're talking, and I want to touch on this title in a second, but the nightmares and dreams and realities of ERPs, which kind of become the nervous system of an organization. Leon Degtar is with us. He's a fractional CFO and COO who's an expert in oversight and operations and turning complex processes like ERPs into something functional. He's got a lot of experience with implementation. He's going to share a lot of insights with us on what to avoid, what drama can happen if, how we should succeed if. And Ryan Walter is a managing director at ProCFO Partners, and he's a strategic mind. He's a force. He's got expertise in making that strategy-aligned execution with operations, with business transformation, and enterprise technology. So welcome, guys. Just a moment of housekeeping. Please put any questions, Q&A that you've got in the little Q&A feature down there. We intend to get to those at the end of our conversation. If we don't have time or whatever, Leon and Ryan will reach out to you directly to make sure that that they give you some attention on that. So, gentlemen, the ERP is such a big thing. It's interesting. That's why we named it Nightmares and Dreams. It keeps us up at night. It's such a huge resource investment, literally financial investment, but it takes a lot of thought, a lot of process, a lot of people. Leon, how do we give us some language around that? Articulate this for us a little bit. Why is this such a big deal? We sense it, we kind of internalize it, we know it, but give us something concrete that we can kind of give us some context as we get into this conversation.
Sure, Chris, thanks. I've been a part of some successful, really custom, interesting ERP implementations, and I've done a lot of technology consulting on my career, and I've talked to companies and business owners that really struggled with this, and it was really costly and painful. So it's never really an easy process. Implementations are often challenging, but I'm going to share a couple statistics. 70% of ERP implementation projects fail to achieve their objectives. That's a study by McKinsey, and a lot of these are coming from some ERP studies. 30% of ERP projects are considered outright failures. 55% of ERP projects take longer than expected to implement. 22% of ERP implementation projects fail due to companies not adequately defining their requirements. 26% of ERP implementation projects fail due to poor project management, and 32 fail due to lack of communication between stakeholders. So those are just some statistics I have from McKinsey and the sort on various studies that have been done on ERP implementations. Now, generally, ERP implementations take 6 to 18 months, depending on size and level of complexity. So you can imagine the cost outlay into this is often in the 6 figures and multiple 6 figures in year one. So the resource constraint on your team, on your systems, on everybody, the costs associated with them, this is a major investment for a lot of companies getting into it. These are usually companies that are growing, that are seeking to become more sophisticated, streamline their data, and the sort. And this is probably one of the most major corporate initiatives that smaller organizations undertake to start acting into the mid-market or above. And it can be downright just disastrous because it's such an cost and resource outlay when done wrong. So I want to share some of the results that I've had to be successful in implementation, some of the stories that I had, and Brian will also kind of share kind of the why you even go into this. So I think these are just important. I want to just, we want to warn some folks here about kind of what goes on. And when you talk to salespeople in these ERPs, they're not going to give you some of these statistics. So I want you to be aware of like some of the risks associated in this.
That's interesting. These numbers are crazy. And Ryan, I can feel from here, I'm in San Diego and you're in Philadelphia, I can hear your spidey senses tingling because 70% don't hit their objectives, 20 something because they didn't plan ahead. Where does strategy exist when the ERP comes into play, and why is this an obstacle that organizations are facing?
Yeah, sure. I think, one thing I want to actually add to Leon, because I think part of that number on cost is probably underestimating it. There's much more we often need to consider when we go into particularly that first year. Usually the software cost is a smaller bit than what I would call the resource cost. And whether that's needing to work with folks from outside the company, consultants, or earmarking a lot of resources internally, I think people need to be prepared anytime you get into this. This is a whole company effort. And this isn't one of those things you sort of go on and say, okay, do your day job, and we're just going to throw the ERP implementation onto this. And I think that gets into a bit of this, that, this really needs to be a strategic initiative and a strategic focus. Let's start a little bit with like, why might that be? I think through there's a lot of examples as to why we might do this. And I think we can see how this then impacts our strategic focus. I mean, maybe it's just due to rapid growth. You've seen so much growth. At a point, Excel spreadsheets and everything was fine, but all of a sudden you've grown 2, 3, 4x, and we can't get our sales orders out. We can't figure out where our inventory is. And as a result, I think you can imagine what that impact might be. Sometimes, again, as we've grown, we have plans for M&A, bring 2 new companies in. Everybody's on a different accounting platform. We can't track, we can't report. Obviously, a lot of times in those opportunities, we're looking at efficiencies. We actually end up incurring more expense than we thought. I think there's moving into new product lines or new markets where things such as complexity of managing new suppliers, new custom orders when maybe you weren't doing custom orders in the past, just stresses your system. And I think finally, when we look at, even in today's day and age, there might be new regulatory or compliance issues that come up. And maybe, think in the pharma space, now you have to track traceability and batch. Maybe you're not able to do that with the current system, what you have. Again, spreadsheets may not be enough. So I think they're one of 100 different reasons as to why someone may come in. But I think where you need to start is understanding where you're trying to go. And in doing so, that allows you to best understand how this can support you in getting there. I think that is a critical thing, Chris, that we often miss when we start this, which is, where are we trying to be? And then how does this support us getting there? What do we need for it to do to help us get there? And that's really where I think this conversation needs to start.
And that gets into what we've talked about a lot in different capacities, which is what's goal setting and where do you want to go? Because some of the things that you mentioned, I could be making a reactionary decision. We're growing quickly. We're doing this. We're doing that. This can't be, Leon, necessarily the kind of thing that I just want to like, we'll do this for a couple of years and then we'll pick that up. This is something where I want to feel like I'm making a decision that I can grow with, that can scale with me. How do we do that and not, I don't know, get the thing that's way too big or bloated with features we're never going to use, or we're nervous because next year there's going to be new tech or new features and maybe this one won't have it. I can find myself complacent because I don't know where to start and I don't know which one will serve me in the future. How do we think about that practically?
I think it really does require due diligence on the business owners and the company's part, right? Like Ryan said, where you want to go. And I think we want to start with the why you need it. And there's a handful of factors. Some folks, like you said, there's growth situations. Some ERPs handle multi-entity very well. Once you kind of get into international, you're really, getting outside of the capabilities of some of the smaller applications. Do you have other modules that you would be looking to consolidate in your organization? I've in the past, you can consolidate CRMs, you can consolidate operational project management systems into them. So is there a cost benefit? Are you going from a multitude of systems into one, which allows a streamlining of data, which has a lot of benefits in the reporting foundation? And really seeing sometimes folks just have a pain in one particular area of their operation, and it can potentially be resolved either with the retooling of your process or your workflows, or maybe an additional smaller system that's easier to implement that really gets to the root cause of where the pain is, and you're not taking kind of like a mallet to a nail situation here. So the other thing just to be wary, and I think my biggest takeaway is just be wary, do your research and do your due diligence to understand where the risks are. I had sat in a lot of sales meetings with sales reps for, it could have been Dynamics, Business Central now, or NetSuite, and they have overpromised, right? Software sales folks, they're there to make their commissions and make this sale. Once you get into technical questions, they don't have necessarily the savvy to properly answer you, and their goal is to get you a yes when they're not necessarily sure. I've had an experience where I requested a really consolidated forecasting report across different modules and systems when I had a custom NetSuite implementation multiple times, promised the world, promised yes, they fell short. It was just a capability that they didn't have. The system implementation made it easier to replicate, but it wasn't automated. So there's a lot of things. Just be really aware. These folks are really good at selling their products. They have a lot of collateral. They have a lot of marketing budget behind them, but their goal is to get you to a sale and make it feel far easier and less effort to get you to a successful implementation than it truly is. I think if you talk to anybody, and Ryan, I know you've been a part of a bunch of implementations, it's always harder than you expect it to be, even when you're successful. It's a challenging process. So really be aware and do your due diligence, understand why you're doing it, where you want to go. Don't build the system for today. If your goal is growth and you're stepping into a new life cycle of your business, then where are you planning? Make the system that can hold well for the next 5 years, and you're not constantly retooling and reworking it. I want to be really clear that 30% were considered outright failures. 70% didn't hit their marks in the implementation. Now, what happens when you have an implementation that doesn't hit its mark? It ends up being a perpetual retooling and reworking. These systems are highly configurable. If there's configurations that aren't done well or considered a future state, you'll be going back and retooling it and spending more money on consultants and having pain points along the utilization. So now you have a system, it's not working as well as you want. Now it's, causing efficiency problems, frustrations with the team, and you're pulling consultants back in to retool it constantly. That in of itself is an additional cost that you can't consider. So a lot of upfront planning and a lot of upfront due diligence is really called for here.
And I think, Leon, one thing I'd add to that too, you kind of touched on this in part of your point. You talked about understanding your process, how you work. And I think that's kind of the other part of this due diligence conversation here. A lot of organizations don't really know how they work. They don't know what day-to-day looks like for different people. And that understanding is really critical to have before you go into what you're trying to do. Like, you need to know what good looks like. Well, how do you know what good looks like if you don't know what it looks like today and you don't know where you're trying to go? And I think that's an important thing, is most of us don't sit around and document all our processes and write how that works and write who's responsible for what. And for those of you who do, that's great. And as a result of that, when we're moving forward, we're kind of flying blind. And, Leon talked about a little bit of, the sales process. That the sales process isn't going to get into what's our process improvement map look like? How are our teams going to work together? That falls on us unless we're bringing consultants in. And you're talking a significant change because this impacts everybody in the company. Often what you find, one of the core reasons for failure is that just not enough time is spent on both involving people in departments and understanding how they work and making them part of the solution, but just in general, how much people resist change. You see that a lot where staff will resist change. And, that gets exacerbated when they're not really given training. I've sat in so many things where they said, oh, the software company, they told us we're ready to go. Said, well, how did they prepare people? Well, they gave us a document. Like, does that document even work for your people? Did anybody go through it? Did anybody explain it? And so what you end up getting is that, one, the solution doesn't work because they never talk to the folks who actually do the job. Two, even if they did, they don't understand what to do and how it'll work. So what does that mean? You get pushback. And guess what everyone's going to do? They're not going to use the system. They're just going to use workarounds. They're going to go back to that old Excel document and manual methods. And now what does that mean? You've got a pretty useless system because maybe it's only reflecting half of what's going on. So that training, communication, and engagement with people, both on understanding the process and people, I just think is critical and has to be part of that due diligence and upfront work.
That is a powerful point. Do you have guidance on, do I do some of that? You're touching on cultural aspects of an organization. Do I kind of pin some of this stuff down before I even get into the ERP process? Do I treat it as part of one? Leon, you mentioned it can take 12 to 18 months. Does it really take 24? Because I got to spend 6 months kind of figuring this out. How do I manage the tension between we really need this but we're not sure who we are and so what we really need? Ryan, how can we think about that a little bit more practically?
Yeah, I mean, you absolutely need to put that in, and whether you want to count that as like T minus time or, time on to the beginning of it, it's critical to have that understanding worked out. Again, this all gets back into how do you know if you got there if you don't know where you're going?
Yeah.
Um, we're we're just not used to as organizations thinking about this and involving folks in that process. So as a result, we haven't talked about this before. We haven't gone through that mechanism of discussing how we work. And as a result, we don't really know how to go through doing that. I think the other reason that's just so critical, so I think that's the cultural side, how we as a company work, and we need to do this because most of us don't sit down and talk about that, is you actually need to have that, because when you go into any of these sales conversations, my best advice is never let them show you a pitch deck. Don't sit there and just let them start showing you what it does, because how do you know if that works for you? My advice, know exactly what you want and tell them, we're going to talk about what we need, what we want, what good looks like. Show us how that'll work for us. And I think that's a really important thing, how that supports you, not just before you go into it, but making that time really effective is ensure you know what you want and you're holding them to show you how will this work. Show us what this is like 6 months in. Show us how this will work for Jane or Joe when they do their jobs. How do we get this forecast or cash flow information out if we know we've got here, and we have such disparate data? How are we going to bring that all together? What will that look like? What will that involve? What change? Hold them to that. That's really important. A, it helps your planning, but B, you can now at least envision, is this thing going to give me what I expect?
Leon, Ryan raises some interesting points that kind of get into that tactical how-to stuff of implementation or of I guess, yeah, your decision making. And you mentioned earlier, kind of in this sales process, and we love salespeople, but in this space, their job is to please get you to try this one. And for sure, they're going to kind of tell us either, yep, it does that, or this is a big famous one. Yes, that is right around the corner. That's in development. Probably in the next month, we're going to see that one roll out, and then it never rolls out. So how do we avoid kind of the being kind of razzle dazzled, and how do we hold inside of these sort of demos and inside of these business sort of emerging relationships? How do we hold ourselves and whoever we're talking to on the other end accountable to what Ryan said? Nope, we want to go here. We want to go here, because it's really easy to kind of be seduced into other ways. How do we build some discipline in that process so that we are focused on the right solution for us and not the right solution as they determine it could be for us?
No, I think that's a great point. And some of the things is, one, like you said, if it's a feature, a planned feature, feature release, it doesn't exist if it's not already there. Just
Don't
assume
buy
it
beta.
doesn't. Can't rely on those things. So don't allow that kind of, and they might be true, but for conservative is better here, right? This is avoiding and reducing risks. As CFOs, as financial folks, we want to reduce risk, and there's a lot of innate risk in a new technology and platform implementation. I think really identify your must-haves and your nice-to-haves, right? Know why. We talked about why you want to do this. So what are the key things that you're trying to get out of it? And what are some nice-to-have? Like if it doesn't do it, and if it's a future feature and it's a must-have, then you really need to sit down and think about how critical that is, and if that is just a showstopper. And as far as kind of demos and some of these things, I just want to kind of clarify what an ERP is. And the reason I've kind of been successful is because I've been in the technology service world for over 10 years, but sitting in that finance operations seat. So it allowed me kind of the insight. I'm familiar because I've worked with other companies to do different technology implementations or build, and adoption, training, rollout. That's always part of it. But upfront, what is an ERP? An ERP is an enterprise resource planning system. They often all have some mode of CRM. Now they all have a marketing module. Now they all have project management. They are all things to all businesses, really, and you're really only talking about two in the mid-market that are the major players, but they'll work if you're a service business, they'll work if you're a manufacturer, they'll work if you're a supply chain, they'll work if, whatever industry and whatever way your business operates, it is the same system. So how do they go about that? It is almost infinitely configurable behind the scenes. So an ERP implementation, what it is you sit with them and you talk about that what, and you write a requirements document, and then you sit there with a consulting team. One of those little changes could be wrong and make things difficult for you all. So, just understand what it is. It's a misstep there because there's so much minutia to configure in these systems can make a hardship as you go about it. So I think it's important to know what these kind of understand back end and how these implementations go when you're looking and talking to folks on the front end, having a little more awareness. I think it's really important to have referral conversations. I was a referral partner for a while to NetSuite, and I had a really custom unique implementation that was for agency and service-based businesses. So I had a lot of calls, and they will do that. Know that you can go call somebody in your industry, a like business with similar, pain points, and make sure you do a lot of that research. I highly, highly recommend always go through a referral interview process when you're in your selection phase. Is going to help you along the way. Understand what implementation is and what it looks like and where some of those pitfalls are along the way. And we'll get into it, but I think understanding that you generally bring a consultant in on these implementations, and I'm going to argue that it is a 50-50 lift on getting an implementation to be successful. Even if you have a 4-person consulting team that is doing an implementation, you're going to need as much muscle and as much dedication on your internal side to be successful. I've seen a lot of companies fail because they were oversold and then said, don't worry, our consultants will handle it. And they thought it's just, let me hand off the reins to the consultants to go do this. But your company is uniquely yours. They do this for everybody. And if you're not holding along the way and making sure they're accountable and know your exact configuration with a level of depth almost as well as your consultants do, you're going to really have a challenge when you roll this out.
And Leon, it's interesting. Two things came to mind as you were talking there. One, I don't know other than to call it shiny object syndrome. So a lot of times when we talk to the sales folks, they'll talk about there's this. I mean, I'm not even talking about features to come, features that exist, but they're not features you use. But you'll hear a lot of, but when you're at this point or this, and that's exciting. It's exciting to think about the growth. What I would tell you is focus more on the stuff you need now. That's really critical. It's great. Maybe you'll get there, but I got to tell you, 9 times out of 10, nobody ends up using this really cool stuff down the road that someone said they may use. So buy it for what you need for it now. And obviously some thought about how it goes forward and what you immediately need. But you really want to be careful when you're thinking about that and how that might actually be used. And is it realistic to think that, that is something you'll begin with and you'll go down, because most people are already busy. Starting to do other things and more things means reallocating what folks are doing. And that change isn't easy. The other thing, as you were talking about, Leon, I think it really gets to the ERPs of today. Sadly, I have to say I started on ERPs in a previous millennium, way back when. And in that time, you talked about how they're really configurable. They absolutely are. And that's both good and bad. These days, you can take it to the nth degree and you can, it's easy, but it also means you can make it incredibly complex. Previously, when these came out, again, in the years that started with 19, they were actually talking about it differently. They would come out and say, no, this is the system. They were impossible to configure. Everything was custom. And they would say, no, we've implemented the best practice for blah, blah, blah. You should change to that, right? And it's interesting to see how much this is really over 25 years, 30 years, this has kind of changed and they've adapted to that. But they're still often going to come to you with that all-in-one trap, right? We can be the answer for everything. One thing to remember with most ERPs, they were built on a specific thing they're good at, maybe manufacturing, distribution, retail, whatever. And a lot of the other components have just been added on. They're not the core focus, or they're sort of added on based on how they align back to that thing they're really good at. We're in a day and age, Leon talked about the configurability, where integration, the movement of data, point-specific tools is much more viable to us. and finding kind of the right solution for the right issue and tying that all together is much more feasible. And again, Leon, I know that's something you have a whole bunch of experience with.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, I think it's an interesting point, even though they're highly configurable, right? But there will always be your business's secret sauce, right? There's something that in your value proposition and probably in your process that might be a little bit different. And you might find a point of rigidity in a system because you say, well, this is important to us. This is what sets us apart because we do things a particular way. And then you start getting into kind of customization, which also gets expensive and challenging in its own right. You also mentioned one thing that I know we're coming up on some time, because a major risk, and I want to call this out for folks, is data. When you're changing from one system to a new system, you're going to want to have historical data. It's going to be important for CFOs. Now, that data migration process, if you have bad master data, or it's not well organized and it doesn't migrate clean, or you haven't maybe cleaned some books, or there's still reconciliations or previous inaccuracies, you're pulling all of that stuff into a new system. And if like the chart of accounts isn't clean or any of other things on the accounting financial side, you want to start really clean. It's not like, well, we hate QuickBooks because we're a mess over here and blah, blah, blah. Like that mess will persist into your new system. And then also there's a limit to how much you can pull in as well. So you have to have like some awareness that it's probably not going to be 100%. It's probably not going to be for the full life of your business. It's going to be maybe limited to 5 years or 3 years or something like that. So be really wary of like, if you have data inconsistencies or issues or inaccuracies, you're going to want to resolve those before you even get into the implementation phase, because it will actually compound on the challenges that you're going to have.
Leon, I absolutely reiterate that. I mean, I think that's a great part. I was like, data is your lifeblood. Quite honestly, you can make it worse if it's not consistent, because honestly, ERPs let you automate and speed things up. So if you start automating, speeding up inconsistencies and unreliable data, you just magnify the problem. It's not something we're often looked at. We're not thinking about, are we naming things the right things? Do we code things the right things? Are we calling them the right thing? This is an activity, and again, get help from outside if you don't know how to do this, but this is something you really need to do. One, it's going to make things work, and it actually means you can rely on reports and you can run forecasts and do everything else that you want. But in most worlds, we have multiple systems that work with each other. Our CRM might tie into our finance system, which might tie into our manufacturing system, which might tie into some, marketing solution and social media tool, whatever it may be. And those things are all passing data between them. You need to make sure there's some consistency in that. So when I'm getting something from here that's talking about a campaign that goes into my CRM that then ties into my finance system, they're all talking the same language. They're talking about the same thing. Otherwise, you lose that traceability. It is an important bit of activity to go through, not something we usually think about, because in earlier days, quite honestly, we resolve it with a human. So-and-so says, oh yeah, we call that company 3 different things, but we all know that, and somebody's just merged the data together. It's not going to work when you get to this. So that upfront data cleansing consistency, as Leon pointed, is just critical.
And it speaks more to that sort of do this before you do that kind of workload. And one thing I want to mention as you guys were talking is there's a lot of features that might exist, but especially when they're bolted on, they're often engineered. They're not designed. And so they can be difficult for the average human being to figure out. There's 62 drop downs and 72 toggles and these check marks or whatever. So that gets back into is this right for you? It's not just about what does it do, but how does it do it? And is that the right thing for your organization? I want to talk a little bit about how do I start? Who should I involve? We've talked a lot about a consultant can help you do this, and this person can help us do that. Ryan, what's my CFO's job in this whole thing? How much should I lean on them, and for what? And who else should be involved that maybe I'm not thinking of? Sure, my C-suite, my team, my executives, these people, but we talked about the rank and file, how this is going to affect them. Who else should be involved that maybe would not be somebody I would have thought of?
Sure. Well, in short, the answer is everyone, but I'll explain on that a little bit later. from a finance perspective, the one unique thing about anybody in a CFO or financial leader position is finance touches everything. Finance is the one thing within an organization that sees what's going on and understands and sees the performance impact or so forth. So finance can't be out of this. Now, there are implementations where a CFO may lead it, maybe not, but they've got to be, if you want to call it stakeholder governance, whatever, and understanding and helping drive what's going on, because anything that changes somewhere, I can almost guarantee is going to impact a finance process somewhere else. If we're doing something different with sales, guess what? It's probably impacting payment terms and how we collect payments or what we owe. If we're doing something in our CRM regarding, how we're getting a contract out, again, do we have traceability back to that? Do we know how to bill? So yes, the key there is definitely involvement throughout, understanding not only from that, what's going on elsewhere and how's that going to impact where we are, right? Because sometimes we'll make this change in manufacturing. It's like, well, but what's that impact to our general ledger? What does that mean? I think in regards then to who involved, and I quipped, but really is kind of representative of everybody. ERPs touch your whole organization. And you really need to think through who will it influence. And again, doesn't mean involve everyone in every meeting and all the time, but anybody who's going to touch it should be represented in the process. Do you understand how they work? Do you understand the impact it's going to have? When you go into anything, you should understand the true impact it'll have across the organization. When you don't involve your marketing group, your sales group, your administration team, folks on the shop floor, you presuppose you've got some answers. And usually what you'll find out is you missed it. And so involving them earlier, talking about what it is, and not just what we're doing, involve them in the discussions, like how does it need to work? How will it work? Help them, let them be part of designing the solution with you. A, it'll be a better solution. B, they'll be bought in. They'll be much more bought in if they're part of it versus I'm inheriting this thing that was just thrust upon me and everybody says it's going to make life better, but it actually doubles the amount of work I need to do and I'm miserable. That to me is really critical at involving that from the start and also letting you get in front of it. And I think Leon said this, there's so much more resource time involved from across your company needed than you are probably prepared. So you need to be ready. I referenced it earlier. Almost always I see, oh yeah, you normally get 5 objectives every year. We're just going to add a 6th. If you try to just bolt this on to keep people, it won't get done. I mean, this is something that takes up a market amount of time, and you need to give it that time to those key folks who will be involved. And it can't just be an add-on activity, or you're going to find it just doesn't represent your organization, and invariably things are going to break down.
We've got
it's when I piggyback a little bit there, because I have some tactical thoughts that I want to just leave with folks around the resources, folks that you need to involve, especially having done some of these. I had a discourse with some folks online about this topic, and I heard somebody state this, and I think it's a bit of hyperbole, but it would work if you take kind of your star players, say like 4 or 5 of them, and put them 100% on an ERP implementation and backfill their day jobs. Like that is some of the advice that I had heard from folks that have gone through in the past. That's a bit much, but I will say, I think there's some key roles. Then I agree, upfront early planning, as you write the requirements for how your processes map to a new system, involve everybody from all departments that are going to be touched. Because if you're adding marketing modules here and CRM, definitely there should be a leader from each of those groups that has a say in how that configuration and how that system is going to be modeled and built. But as you go along the implementation, because you're going to have the discourse with all of those groups and departments and folks involved to map the configuration of the new system. Now, as you start getting into the implementation, there's a couple key roles that you need. You need a product owner or stakeholder that knows this system front to back, because when you get to training and adoption, you need a guru. Somebody, one of the leaders of this implementation internally needs to be the guru of the system that really knows it top to bottom. And then there should be some sub leaders that, like somebody who leads on the sales side, if there's sales process workflow or marketing or operations. You need a project manager, really need a project manager internally. You'll have a project manager externally with your implementation team, but they have their own self-interest. They're not necessarily always in the interest of you as an organization. They want to hit the project on time, on budget, as quickly and as painlessly as possible. but you may not know if there's some decisions along the way that need to be adjusted. So having a PM on your side also holds them accountable if they slip on their timeline or some of their workflows. So I think those are kind of key. The guru, the project manager, and other couple key leads depending on whatever modules and features that you have. And those folks need to be involved, have internal and external regularly set check-ins on this project until it's completed. Because if you just let it go and you say, we set all this stuff up, then we can, and then you let them run, and then 7 months later, you don't know where you're at. You need to hold everybody accountable and make sure that the implementation is doing right by your organization.
And interestingly enough, Leon, if not as if we're already scaring people enough, I would say, taking an even macro perspective on this, you talked about how many people need to come in. There's actually more to this than just the ERP, because really you need to look at the ERP as part of sort of your broader digital ecosystem that you have at the company. It's got to work with everything else. And so you need to be thinking about this ecosystem in a way of how does everything work together? How is this going to evolve over time? Can it be adaptable? Can it move? The last thing you want to do is, oh, we built this ERP one-off, it works great, but now it's an anchor. And it literally does not allow us to do anything new that we want to do. We can't take advantage of a new opportunity because it like locks us into where we are. Looking at it as part of your broader technology stack and perspective and how it helps everyone work is critical. And again, I'm not going to get into enterprise architecture. Leon can talk much more about what that is than I can. But I think that's an important thing to think about, that it is not a standalone tool. You've got to look at how it fits into everything.
Do you have some guidance for us on where do I compromise? Because as Leon pointed out, we've got leaders from every division doing this and this and this. Nobody's going to be, it's not going to be everything to everybody. It's going to be most things to most people or some things. How do we as a team compromise both on the selection and also on the implementation? We talked about accountability. How does that work? What does that mean? How do I hold my team accountable? What are the KPIs that I should start to think about when it comes to this? Leon, let me throw that to you first. How do I compromise? And how do I make sure that that doesn't get in the way of a smooth implementation?
Well, the hope and the goal here is to not compromise, right? You
I
set
love
your
that.
You set your standards up front, and you do so with as much due diligence, research, and awareness as possible, right? I think compromises come when you make some undue assumptions, right? If you don't have clarity and you already know what you're getting into, because maybe compromise in what you're getting at in the system when you say, oh, okay, it hit my must-haves, but not some of my nice-to-haves. But you should have that known pre-implementation, right? So if we're getting into an implementation, we've already kind of set some of our compromises, maybe, but we're not making any assumptions. You have that knowledge and understand that the first step in the implementation is going to be writing that requirements document. And you're going to have a consulting team come in and you're going to sit with all of your leadership and all of those parties. And you're going to do all of that deep dive, some level of deep dive. Well, higher level, the deep dive gets a little more probably as you go, but you're gonna get pretty a lot of your processes written out, and this is going to be a pretty intensive effort upfront. It's going to probably take multiple days, maybe multiple weeks before anybody touches any technology. It is all documentation, and that documentation is critical to success. And generally speaking, they will sit and have these sessions. They will provide you back this requirements document. That requirements document needs to be really, really, really reviewed in depth multiple times. It should be redlined. It should generally have some back and forth. Don't just accept it, question everything. There's continued diligence that needs to go along the way. Now, once that requirements document is essentially inked in and it's finalized, that's essentially your roadmap to the build. And for project managers or leadership, say, use that, if you've ever managed a project or reviewed the scope, and then they're going to provide you a timeline, a budget, and generally within that requirement stock, there's going to be modules and sections of elements of the system that you're going to build. And then you map that into your project, hold it to dates, hold it to timelines, hold it to completion level. There should be testing as modules are completed. You should have some of it, and this is where kind of boots on the ground folks should get involved. We built this out. We ran this process before we're actually putting it into practice. There should be a sandbox environment that's provided to you and say, okay, let me get my AP clerks to go run our new, process, or Let me have some of our sales folks map opportunities or leads through the new CRM modules before it actually goes in. Because you might be able to tinker a bit along the way. There's always a little bit of wiggle room. But ideally, if you map it out and hammer it home well, then as you go, you check off that the thing has been done, this module has been done. There's a cycle of testing that has to be done, maybe a little bit of rework, ideally not much. But then you get folks at the ground level and production level touching the system before it's in practice, getting to be able to get a feel for it, providing a feedback loop. And that's a good way to kind of keep these projects moving forward. It's a phased approach. The BRD is the first phase, and then it creates sub phases, and you should have all of the kind of project plan. Once that's done, project plan from the consulting. When are things going to be done? When do I get a demo? When do I get a test environment? And hold them to their plan as best as possible.
And
Ryan
Chris, I
is
think
right.
I was going to say, Chris, on the compromise side, I'd just kind of conclude with, compromise, trade-offs, whatever you want to call them, prioritizations, they're always going to be out there, right? And I think you could look at these there might be some budgetary concerns, and you've got to figure out what matters when. I think sometimes too, the compromise might just be, we can't do it all at one point, right? Like we talk about phased rollouts, we talk about stages. In the old days, we would talk about big bang, like roll the whole thing out to the whole company. Well, maybe we have to compromise, and we'll do that over 9 months, just due to what it is and the impact that's there. Look, to me, you have to go back and look at what's the impact, what happens, what can we work with, how does that influence us? It's an ongoing thing, because even with the best plans, we have thoughts about how we're going to do it, and then we'll find 4 weeks before we go live, this isn't doable, or we've got to do this data work and it's not going to happen. So that should be an open dialogue. I think it's something you should even track. I think anybody, I'm not a project management expert, but anyone in project management is going to track risks. They're going to track trade-offs and other things like that. And that's something when I call it governance or leadership, should look at. Because again, that should be understood by the whole organization. Why are we not doing this? Why are we still going to maintain 3 Excel spreadsheets in this thing? Well, we couldn't do that. And quite honestly, until this thing's been running for 6 months, we can't even bring them on. Okay. Right. And we couldn't afford to bring on that other module. So I just think you got to look at it as a couple different ways you may compromise, and then you make the best decision you can with as much information around what you want to prioritize and the impact it's going to have on the people, processes, and the results you're looking for.
These are some ways that you can contact Ryan and Leon. They'll be popping up on your screen here in a second. We invite your feedback. We'll have more of these. If there are some specific questions or issues that you want to really dig in and address. And if you've got something that really piqued your interest here and you want to reach out to either of these guys individually, they'd love that. Thank you, gentlemen, for your expertise, your generosity with that expertise. I have a zillion more questions, so I kind of want to do a part 2. This has been fantastic. What a great way to think about it. I love that we've had some practical, tactical stuff, some great big strategic stuff. I come away with some new ways of thinking about this. I hope our audience does too. Thank you, everyone, very much for joining us this morning, this afternoon, wherever you are. And reach out to us if we can help you. We would love to.
Thank you.
Thank you all.